to the cloud. And as we continue talking about course design, I want to remind you that for these following weeks, you will be working with somebody else completely, it could be the same people you've been working with or a different person, different people. That's up to you. You get to decide whether you want to mix things a little bit and, change and experience working with other people. A couple of you have emailed me asking whether you could work solo because you have your own independent projects where you are actually developing an online course and you want to get some feedback from your peers. I think if that is the situation, not only of these two people, but also of other people in this room, you can do as well that. Just let me know, send me an email if that's the case. In the same way, if you're working with other people, just send me an email to update me. I think that's just part of the online etiquette, to make sure that we know where we are at. So as you work with other people, we have then, we are thinking about two tasks. So the first task is to design an outline for that online course. You get to choose a topic. It could be anything you're interested in, anything you want to explore in the future. Some of you, from my experience and from what I have heard from you in our past meetings, is that you might want to go ahead and do some kind of teaching of language teaching and so on. So you could do something related to that. And as you think about a course, a topic for a course, what we're going to do is to design an outline. Simple, it doesn't have to be a big task. My best advice at this point is be simple, don't be too complex, because especially if it is the first time doing this, so you don't want to complicate things, you want to make things easier for you and enjoy the process rather than suffer through the process. Okay, so you choose the topic that you're interested in, you develop an outline. We have given you some examples of an outline, which I will show you on screen as well. And then you also develop a learning material. So it doesn't have to be the whole course. You're not developing the whole course. That's not our expectation. But it is important to show us that, some tool that you're going to use, how you're going to use it. So if you say, I'm going to use Google Slides, then why not presenting how your Google Slides would look like for that specific course? And you just choose one section of your course and like showing that specific session for the day. And that's it. You could also do a video, a blog, a podcast, an infographic, and I mean, the world is your oyster. This is where you show your creativity. So that's the two tasks you're doing. We have talked about last class about learning outcomes. We'll get back to that point in a little bit. But there are other things that are really important to consider when we talk about course design. We mentioned last class that the different models that we have explored could be applicable and implemented not only for online design, but also for face-to-face and blended learning. Which one you use? When you become a tutor, when you become somebody who's designing something, it also, there are many factors influencing your decision. So if you work in an institution, your institution might tell you which model you should use. If you work by yourself independently, you get to choose the model that you think fits or is best for your own purposes. And also, that teaching context, it gets to influence all of those decisions, as I mentioned before. But we're following the HEL model, which I think is, it has a combination of different models. It combines the Salmon model for e-learning. It also combines the Carpe Diem model, and it follows the structure of the other models. So because it has this complexity and dynamics of interacting with other models, and because it also is also the one that we use at the university, I think it could provide you with a good experience. But as I said before, last class, if you want to try a completely different model or any other models that we have learned and about last class, you could also just let me know. Any questions so far about what we're doing? Okay, so it was just a summary of what we did last class. The same learning outcomes because we are still in week 9, module 7. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of your group work. You will start writing your learning outcomes today and do a bit of storyboarding. These are processes that might look like very complex, but they're really simple. And as I said, if you think about something simple, you shouldn't really, complicate your lives. Hopefully the idea is that you enjoy the process today, interacting with your peers. And you're not thinking, very big, just think small. I would say less is more. There's a saying where, less is more. Again, because all of what we are doing from week 8, 9, 10, and 11 informs your assignment part 2, which is, your reflective piece. There are some questions that I always ask people to think about. Last week, we saw the first 4 questions there. If you found them useful for yourself to write about your work, your work experience, your collaborative work experience, which is your group work, that's fine. You don't have to focus on group work. You could focus on other aspects, simply in the aspects of, course design. Remember this reflective piece, you get to decide what kind of topic you want to talk about. I think this is what we did for last year, but again, you're free to choose execute your autonomy as well. And as usual, let me know as well, because if you don't tell me what your thoughts are so far in the assignment, reflective piece, I wouldn't really know how to support you. So remember, I'm here to support you. I'm here to hear you about what it is that you're interested in doing. And then I could help you as well, facilitating more reflective prompts for your reflective journal, if that is the case, and you need that extra support. So to locate the prompts, these reflective questions in Canvas, usually you'll find them in the Google Slides or at the end of the session, which is the last page of Canvas where I put the video. And that's because the idea is that you complete the module and then you get into the reflective journal bit. That's the rationale. Let's then get started to talk about other elements that we need to keep in mind when we are thinking about course design. Last class, we talked about models, but there are other things that we always need to keep in mind. And these are things that we have discussed before, but it's just a good reminder of, of what we really need to have handy in our minds, somewhere written, so that we are also thinking about those details. Just, simple, what activities you are going to be including. So when we're talking about course design, we always think about, one session. What would that session look like? What kind of content will talk about? What kind of activities you want to ask your students to engage with? And then as you think about activities, which will always be developed after you design your learning outcomes. Remember, if you don't start with your learning outcomes, you would struggle to think about what kind of things you could add as part of the interactivity in your online teaching. And as you think about activities, you also think about technology, of course, when you think about what synchronous tools, what asynchronous tools you could incorporate. And we have mentioned, sometimes these there's a blur, very blurry line between, what's synchronous and what's asynchronous. And it also depends on the mode of how people really connect. So I could be texting on WhatsApp, and the other person on the other end could really be responding right away, or could take some time responding, at the end of the day, whenever that person is not busy. So in that way, it kind of acts both ways, synchronous and asynchronously. So what kind of interactions you want to have with your students? What kind of tools will facilitate that interaction? That's important to think about. Other elements that we have discussed in the past, and you may remember this slide, are those elements of flexibility. And when I mentioned before autonomy, you choose what you really want to do for these following weeks, because this is where you really show your creativity. So the idea is that then you are empowered. We give you that power so that you get to shine. And you choosing something is all about flexible learning, executing your autonomy. What kind of socialization you want to incorporate in your course? Yes, think about learning materials, content, technology, language. You may have multilingual students, people that you also share different languages with. So there are contexts that are bilingual, if that's the case of your own teaching context, are you including different languages in your materials? That would be interesting to note as well. Flipping the classroom, we've mentioned this before as well. So one of the very, very common methods in online learning is that you provide materials for people to engage before the session, and then you do activities during the session, and then you have a post-session material that students can engage with after the class. We've also mentioned facilitation, and facilitation is all about making sure that the learning process is student-centered rather than teacher-centered. I may want to do many things with my students and based on my own preferences, but if I don't know my students, I don't know their needs, I don't know what they actually require to learn in order to achieve the learning outcomes, then you're missing out the point. So all about student-centered is asking students to be part of the process of producing knowledge, engaging with knowledge, be active with that process of creating, doing things, developing their critical thinking, having as much group work, collaborations as possible, so that they don't feel that they're by themselves. And that's one of the struggles in online learning. If you really don't collaborate with others, you probably, this won't be a meaningful experience. When we talk about online socialization, you might remember the model, Salmon model of e-activities or e-online learning, e-learning activities or online learning, I think that's what she calls it. And that stepped process, how do you engage your students from, motivation to socialization, them developing something, them presenting something. Another thing that you could think in have in the mind, in the back of your mind, is what kind of pedagogies. This is when we start thinking about, what is your philosophy? What kind of philosophy are you developing as a potential tutor in the future? Yes, the philosophy, our beliefs, our values, how we see education is informed by our previous experiences, but also now that you learn about different pedagogies, you could think about, oh, that's interesting. I've never done it in my own learning experience. I'm happy to experiment. Then this is a moment where you could incorporate all of those thoughts in your course design. So we've talked about the community of inquiry, that involves that social presence, cognitive presence, teaching presence. And those are elements that are important in any educational experience, not only online learning. And as part of the pedagogies, we did mention, constructivism, collaborative, the collaborative approach, integrative approach, the reflective approach. The inquiry-based learning is very similar to what we've seen before, which is that COI from Garrison. You don't need to be an expert on, on knowing in detail all of these pedagogies. I think what you need to think about is what is important to your students. What do you think your students really need in order to achieve the learning outcomes? How you can facilitate the process, and therefore, would you need approaches that are collaborative, constructivist, reflective? And if so, well, keep them in mind, because then your activities need to involve those different dimensions that are going to be relevant for your students. So this is where we remove ourselves from our preferences and think about what the students need, what kind of approaches would be more appropriate for their own learning, and then start implementing those approaches when we design our activities. Similar, again, other types of approaches which are very similar to the previous ones. We've seen blended learning. Somebody asked this question, what do we mean by blended learning when we are talking about online learning? Well, what kind of synchronous and asynchronous activities would you have? And also we talk about, what kind of pedagogies? Are you mixing up different approaches? Are you focusing on one approach or one pedagogy, or you would be combining them? There's no problem in combining approaches as long as you have your own rationale, and that rationale is based on the teaching context and your students. Multiliteracies, what kind of multiliteracies would you need? We talk about, language and language diversity, especially those contexts where we have students from different backgrounds and they have different linguistic resources. Are you gonna be approaching your online learning more like a gamification? Is playing games important in your course unit? If so, then I would expect to see you developing a session where it's all about getting students into playing, creating, engaging, collaborating, developing, and that's all what gamification is about. Experiential learning, are they experiencing with different things? Then the practical aspect needs to be present as well. Now we talked about critical pedagogies. Actually, we didn't talk about that, but we will, mention this as part of, the different pedagogies that are out there. Has anyone in this room encountered the term critical pedagogies? Just want to see. Okay, yes. Any thoughts? Ulkar, can you tell me a little bit more? Just because I can see you nodding, can you tell me a little bit of what you remember so far about this term, critical pedagogies? Just to take a break as well. I need some.
I heard the term digital pedagogy. Digital pedagogy, it's they were like how wisely use digital tools to enhance learning.
Yes. So what use do we give to these different tools? And more importantly, are these tools promoting different practices? So if you see the three different colors, we can start from the very top as well as, bottom up or top down, doesn't matter. But critical pedagogies involve three important dimensions: principles, aims, and practices. So if we talk about practices, are students using the tools critically? Do they know how to engage? Do they know how to explore content, analyze it, select it, engage with it in active ways in which, they're not just using tools because, they have to, but they know how to use them, when to use them, what the benefits are, what kind of limitations they have. So, for instance, if we talk about, if we're asking students to engage in social media, such as, Facebook or WhatsApp or WeChat, do they know how to use it? Are they engaging critically with, those tools? So effective use of, different digital tools, where they are just, they need to be thinking about how they use it, why they use it, what are the purposes of using these tools? Is it just because it's the norm? Is it just because I was told? Or do I really see some benefits? Co-creation, a lot of the tools that we use is because they facilitate the process of co-creating knowledge. Are students aware of this? The idea of collaboration, collaborative learning, using different tools. Do students know, when they engage with the internet and the different content that is out there for them to explore? Do they know how to respect, the views of others, how to contribute or add on to the knowledge that already exists without plagiarizing information? Do they know how to reference and use the resources in a way that they are, giving credit to the people they read and critique, and also developing their own knowledge? And then we have aims. So digital pedagogies have different aims. Students need to become aware of, other oppressions. For instance, we know that, in the Western world, there are different tools that might not be useful or relevant in different contexts. Do they know about this? Are they aware? Are there any limitations on not being able to engage with the rest of the world in different ways? What are these limitations? And how do these limitations might impact themselves, their society, and so on and so forth? So this is when we get into the politics of, what we have available, how we engage with this information, and how we interact with that information, because our actions are form of, are part of the social context in which we interact, in which informs politics at the end of the day. Do students and teachers make connection between, that personal experience and that bigger social, broader context? Again, we go back to critical thinking, whether the learning environments are relevant for them to continue developing these different academic critical skills that they need, not only in their daily basis, but also to engage appropriately with different people through different ways. And then we have this baseline where we talk about the principles. So do we know that knowledge should be co-created and not just something that is given and people need to follow? So do you know your role in your society and how your own ways of seeing and understanding the world influence society, and how society influences you and who you are? So are you aware of these relationships of your, the different nuances and contexts that are involved in a classroom like this one, that we have people from different places of the world? But are we aware of that? And when we engage in conversation with other people, are we aware of, of the impact that we may have by saying something to somebody, and so on? Education is a human process. It's not just something, that should be done because we say so. It's part of developing human beings. So there's a human element in digital pedagogies. But this is just a brief introduction to this term. If you are more interested in exploring it in your own independent time, you could do so. But the idea is that you keep in mind, these different aspects when you're engaging with developing your activities and your materials. You don't have to keep everything in mind, but if you have one element here and there, that shows that you are thinking critically. So for example, if you're going to develop as a learning material a video, and I'm going to go back to the example of languages, are you going to providing your video subtitles, captions for people with different disabilities. If you remember that model of UDL as well, that we talked about last class. So are you taking into account all these different multiliteracies and for other people to use them effectively and engage with your content in meaningful ways? That's a way of thinking critically when you're engaging with digital pedagogies, for instance. Some more information, and there's a podcast there. That's one thing I found, but that's more based on the American context. What critical pedagogy looks like. There's some links there for you to explore. And before we go into our next bit, I'd like to take a 5-minute break. Is that okay? So we'll see each other 25 past 2:11, 25 to 11. Okie dokie, I'll stop recording just for now. So last class, we talked about the HEL model. We're still in the orange bit, developing learning outcomes. You really cannot start developing anything else without clear learning outcomes. You may have an idea of what you want to do for a specific unit, but the purpose of creating learning outcomes is because they give you with a guide about what the students really need to be able to do. And therefore that will help you to think about the content, the activities, the materials, the interactions involved, and so on and so forth, the type of tools involved. And that's why we always, depending, it doesn't matter what model you use, you will always be requested to develop learning outcomes. And last class, we did say something about learning outcomes. And I want to just give you a recap of what they are. So we talked about learning outcomes as developing the purpose of either a module or the whole unit. So I would say, think about simple, small, think about something small. So you think about your topic for the course unit. Think about what would be the main, the one or the two or the three key purposes of developing this unit. What would be your learning outcomes? These are broader learning outcomes. That's where we start. Of course, when you design an outline, when you think about the different modules, each module could have their own specific learning outcomes. And that's just to continue giving you purpose and giving students purpose. Because if they don't know what they're learning, they might be like, oh, well, is this relevant to me? Do I need this? So it's always about giving people purpose. So we think about two types of learning outcomes. The wider ones, the key ones that run across the whole unit, and the more specific ones that you could develop within a specific module that you want to develop. So we start with the big ones. And you could think about one learning outcome in the meantime, or maximum two, I would say, so that you don't complicate things and you make the task simpler for yourself. So your learning outcome or outcomes should incorporate three elements: audience, task, and context. So the audience is always going to be the students. That's no brainer. Who's going to do the task? Students. When we talk about learning outcomes, we need to put the students as the audience. So it would say something like, students will be able to, students will do this or that. So you always start with a sentence, students, and the rest you complement with what you want them to achieve. So what is the task? To think about the task, we talked about Bloom's taxonomy, if you remember from last class. And Bloom's taxonomy is important because it gives you different verbs at different levels of, engagement, cognitive engagement. So it is clear what they're doing. So what are you asking students to do for that specific class or that specific module? So we're starting with the bigger outcomes, isn't it? So what do you want them to be able to do at the end of their course? If you decide that your course takes 4 weeks, well, what do you want them to be able to do when they finish those 4 weeks of the course? That's when you need to think about the ending. What's the outcome? What's the product? What do they get from engaging with your materials? And then the context. The context is in a given task. Where is this task situated? And then we have that example of students who are architects, and they're given a specific task. They need to develop a public or design a public open space in a specific area, in a specific country, in a specific city, with a specific budget. And that's what they need to do. So we know that students do this. We know what task it is. They need to design something, and we know the context. Well, it's a bit unclear there what country, what area. But you could make that clearer, for instance. That would be my critique in this learning outcome. Maybe the context is a bit still unclear, but you could develop and put a very specific context. So we're going to go away with our peers, the people that we've been working with. If there are any changes in who you work with, just let me know so that I can create another group and you can go in there. And the task is to think about your broader learning outcomes. So you can think about 1 or 2 learning outcomes just to get into the practice of it. You have 10 minutes to think about a learning outcome. I want you to write it down and put it in the chat box. But also, we're going to be using, put it in the chat box, and I'll get back to all of the learning outcomes that people share. Do we know what we're doing? Yeah, we're having a go creating 2 learning outcomes. Just start with the first one, and then I'll be popping into your rooms, helping you in the process. So I'm going to stop the recording.